Good morning, everybody. I'm Mel Granick, KS2G. Welcome once again to Ham Radio University 2022 and the Basics of HF Operating Forum. We'll be discussing, as you can see on the slide on screen right now, the bands, the modes, propagation on their procedures, lots of other things. A note of caution for those of you who signed up for this. I don't want anybody to be here under false pretenses. I'm not going to be talking specifically about equipment and how to choose it. That's a different subject for a different time, but there'll be some information about how to use the controls on the HF radios that you do have. So I just want you to be aware of that in case you were coming here thinking I'm going to tell you how to buy the right HF radio transceiver. But I will be giving you information that will be useful in you making that decision on your own. So we're going to be going at light speed here, so we'll be taking questions at the end. Use the chat screen to post any questions you might have, and if we run out of time, you can email me directly. I'll give you an email address for that at the end. So, just a word of note about our founder, Phil Lewis, N2MUN, founder of Ham Radio University, who unfortunately is SK as of 2020. Phil was an inspiration for all of us. He came up with the idea of Ham Radio University as a forum, a forum for education and information for ham radio operators, particularly those who haven't been active in a long time, those of you who are newcomers, and those of you who are exploring new aspects of amateur radio. So quickly, let's take a quick poll so I understand who I'm talking to. George, can you please launch this poll for me? Okay, check the appropriate box. Never operated HF at all, operate every now and then, or operate HF a lot. And George, give me the results as soon as you think you got them.
Yeah, almost everyone has voted. Just stand by 1 second. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now.
Okay, so I see that an awful lot of you have never operated HF. That's a good thing because that's what this is for. Those of you who are casual operators, I think you'll find some very useful information. Even those of you who operate HF a lot, I hope I'll be helpful to you too as well. So let's get to it. We've only got 50 minutes total, and we've already used 3 of those, so let's get going. Just a note, since this is a worldwide event, we have some attendees from outside the United States, and all of the license, band plan, and regulatory information that I'll be providing is applicable only to US licensees. It's likely to be different for operators who are licensed outside the United States, outside of FCC jurisdiction. So here we go. What are the HF bands? There are 10 frequency bands, and they range between 1.8 and 30 megahertz. I've listed them out here on the screen. I won't bother reading all of them. They range from 160 through 10 meters, and there's a lot of space for us to operate on HF, and I'll be explaining the aspects of the different bands as we go along. Because the question is, why are there so many bands in the first place? Well, each HF band has particular propagation characteristics that we take advantage of. Some bands are better for long-range communications, and some are better for short-range communications. Some are better in the daytime, and some are better at nighttime. Some are better in the wintertime. Some are better in the summertime. Some are better at the top of the sunspot cycle, and some are better at the bottom of the sunspot cycle. And also the types of the noise levels of the bands, they have different noise level characteristics, and also the types of operators, the types of QSOs that you'll find vary from band to band and segments within the band. So you'll hear references to the lower HF bands and the higher HF bands. Generally speaking, the lower bands, which are 160 through 40 meters, they tend to be better in the winter time than in the summer. They're better at the bottom of the sunspot cycles than at the top, but they're useful at both ends of the cycle. They tend to be local regional bands for the daytime, and they tend to be much better for DX at night. Higher bands, 30 through 10, they're better in the summer than the winter. They're better at the top of the sunspot cycle, and their DX day and night bands when the sunspot cycle is at its top, and their DX day and closed at night at the bottom of the cycle, somewhat the way we are right about now. The HF subbands in the United States under FCC rules, each HF band is divided into frequency ranges for specific modes, CW, digital data, and phone. And they're also divided by license class, different segments for novices and technicians, segments where generals have permission to operate, advanced class operators and extra class operators can use the entire frequency bands. So they're divided by mode. Looking at the modes, CW on the HF bands, it's permitted on any frequency band. You can use any frequency on any band to operate CW. That said, CW is generally found in the lowest part of each HF band. The digital and data is permitted in the lowest part of each band as specified by the FCC, but generally found just above the CW section. And lastly, the phone bands, they're permitted in the upper 1/2 to 3/4 of each band. You operate lower sideband on 40 meters and below, 160, 40, and 80. And you operate on upper sideband on above 40 meters, 30, 20, 15, 10. Now, why is that? There's no regulation on that. That's a convention. So you can operate upper sideband on 40 meters, and you can operate lower sideband on 20 meters, but people generally tend not to do that. There are occasions where that can come in handy in terms of if you're in a QSO and there's interference, you can switch from lower to upper sideband or vice versa. But generally speaking, lower sideband 40 meters and down, upper sideband 40 meters, above 40 meters. So how do you keep track of all this? Well, the ARRL puts out this handy dandy color-coded chart, which you can download from the ARRL website, and it gives you an easy way to reference which band segments are used on which modes and by which license class. I've been licensed for 45 years. I still keep one of these on my desk because it's handy for me to realize, even though I'm an extra class operator and I can operate anywhere, it gives me the segments where the operators who are, let's say, advanced class or general class in the phone bands operate, so I can figure out where I might want to be. If I'm looking to make a lot of contacts in a contest, for instance, and I want to be able to have my CQ accessible to general class operators, I want to put my signal down in the general class subband. So again, you can download this chart from the ARRL website. One note, the HF bands are not channelized. This is a misconception I see online, particularly by newcomers to amateur radio overall who come out of the CB world, or I see it in technician class operators who come out of the UHF, VHF world. HF bands are not channelized. You don't have to be on any particular frequency. There are no hard and fast calling frequencies. And the frequency readout on your radio does not have to end in a 0. You know, it doesn't have to be an even number. It doesn't have to be 295.000. That's why we have VFOs, variable frequency oscillators. You can put your signals down anywhere. The one exception to that is 60 meters. 60 meters is 5 specific 2.8 kilohertz wide channels, and they're centered on the frequencies that you see on the slide. Also on 60 meters, in addition to whatever power limitations apply to license classes, particularly to novice and technician class licenses for phone operation, power is limited on 60 meters to effective radiated power equaling 100 watts PEP using a dipole. If you use a different kind of antenna, there's a requirement that you make note of that in your station records. Okay, so moving right along. Since we can tune anywhere and we don't have to worry about channels, but we do have to worry about band edges and sub-band edges, okay? So on single sideband, bear in mind, on phone, your signal is typically 2.5 to 3 kilohertz wide. Therefore, you have to stay at least, to be safe, at least 3 kilohertz away from the edge of a band or a subband. Now, when you operate on lower sideband, that means that you have to tune at least 3 kilohertz above the band edge. And on upper sideband, you have to tune 3 kilohertz below the top edge of the band. In my younger days, when I was a newbie, I actually got an OO notice about being out of band because I was unaware of this. So here's the example. In the 40-meter general phone band, the subband ends at 7.175 megahertz. So you can't tune any lower, can't set your transmitter to any lower than 7.178 megahertz. Otherwise, the width of your signal will put you out of band. The top of the 20-meter phone band is at 14,350 for everybody. So you can't transmit with your frequency set any higher than 14.3.7 because the width of your signal will put you above 14,350 and you'll be out of band. Here's what this looks like in real life. This is something I found during a contest a couple of years ago. The operator of II2S sets his VFO transmit frequency at about 14.348. You can see his 2.5 kilohertz wide bandwidth, and that puts him beyond the edge of 14,350. So to be safe, he would have to be down at 14.347 where VE9CB is to stay within band. So remember the band edges. So what modes where on each band? Remember I said there are sub bands and so forth, and how do you know what to put where? Here's a chart. I know you can't read it too well on the slide, but you can download it. If you go into your Google or whatever search engine you use and Google the Considerate Operators Frequency Guide, you'll find this list, which shows you where CW is on each band, where the digital mode hang out, CWQRP, single sideband, slow scan television, experimental operations and so forth. This is also a handy guide to keep in mind if you operate many different modes. And as I said, just Google the Considerate Operators Frequency Guide. You'll find this online and you can download it and print it out. Likewise, in the digital modes, there are many of them, what I like to call the alphabet soup modes. There are so many different ones, it's tough to keep track of. And as you can see on this slide, even when you print out a list of them, the type gets to be very small. This is another one which shows where you'll find FJP3 and so on and so forth. And again, just go into a search engine, amateur radio HF digital mode frequencies. It'll bring you to the URL that you see at the bottom of the screen. You can print this one out. As far as digital modes are concerned, of course, the most popular one these days is FT8. FT8 has these frequencies as the common frequency centers that you use for FT8. One recent estimate, FT8 is about 75% of all current HF activity. The nice thing about these frequencies that your FT8 software has them built in. If you use WSJTX, there's a little pull down menu on the left side of the screen where you can pull down whatever band you want. If you pull down 80 meters, it'll put you on 3.573. Likewise, if you pull down 20 meters, it'll put you on 14.074. You don't have to worry about dialing these in precisely with your VFO. So let's talk about HF propagation, because it's HF propagation that's the reason you want to be on the HF bands in the first place. There are basically two kinds of transmission waves in HF, and RF for that matter. There's ground wave and there are sky waves. And as you can see in the illustration, ground wave is basically point to point. And sky wave goes up into the sky. That's why what the names come from. And there are important differences in terms of ground wave versus sky wave and why one is preferable to the other. Thing about ground wave is it's limited. This is a chart that appeared in QST. I believe it was in the October edition of QST this year. And as you can see, the way they put this graph together in my mind is a little bit backwards. But if you look down at the bottom of the left-hand side, you can see like 2 megahertz. That's about, just about where 160 meters is. And if you look to the right, you can see the range at low frequencies for ground wave is very long, maybe like 100 miles or more. That's why broadcast stations, AM broadcast stations, which are just below 160 meters, carry long distances in the daytime. As you go up in frequency, you can see that the ground wave distance gets reduced pretty much dramatically when you get up to like 10 meters up at the top end of the left-hand side of the graph, you can see that at ground wave, you might get 10, 12, 15, if you're lucky, 20 miles. So ground wave is not very useful, and there's really not much DX to be had other than stateside stations that might need states that you might need for worked all states, that kind of thing. Not much DX to be had with ground wave. Where does DX come from? DX comes from HF propagation with the use of the ionospheric layers. You can look at this illustration of what those look like. You can see the ones we're interested in are called the D, E, and F layers. And take a note of this because we'll come back to it later on. On the day side of the planet, in daylight, all those layers exist. The D, E, and 2F layers exist. As you get into nighttime, the D layer, the E layer start to dissipate and eventually disappear entirely on the right side of the globe, which is in nighttime. Those layers of the ionosphere, the D and E layers, disappear entirely, and the 2F layers, the F1 and F2 layers, tend to merge. This will become important in understanding HF propagation in just a moment, because the ionosphere and the different layers can refract the sky waves. Basically, what happens is, as you see in this illustration, you transmit, sky waves go up, they reach the ionosphere. Charged particles in the ionosphere have an effect in refracting or bending the sky wave and point it back down to Earth. And that's what gives us long distance HF propagation. Sky wave refraction causes long distance skip. Okay, look at the left side of the illustration. We're looking at the 10-meter band, and we're transmitting from New York City, and you can see the sky waves go up at different angles. On the leftmost side of the angle, the sky waves are going almost, pretty much vertically. As the angle reduces and reaches what's called the critical angle that you can see marked off in the center of the illustration, reaches the ionosphere, the charged particles bend the wave back down to Earth and bring it down at a different location rather than the signal going off into space and being totally lost. Now, you can see the critical angle is important in terms of where your wave comes down. If we're transmitting from New York City, you can see the third angle from the left is a critical angle, and it comes down to Earth, but it misses the city of Chicago. So that angle doesn't work for us if we want to have a QSO between New York City and Chicago. Likewise, it doesn't work for us if we want to reach a station that's in Denver, because the sky wave comes down off the ionosphere and falls short. So the correct angle is the one that's immediately to the right, which brings us to New York City, skipping down toward Denver. This is the reason why HF propagation is so sort of unpredictable. You never know exactly where your signal is going. Is it going straight up through the ionosphere and out into space where no one can hear it? Or is it coming down someplace in the middle of nowhere? Like if you want to work Europe, is it coming down in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean where there's no one to hear it? Or is it reaching the UK where you want to work a station? Multi-hop propagation helps solve part of this problem. This is the same illustration, and you can see again with the critical angles being different. If we get a higher critical angle from New York, we reach Chicago. If it's a little bit lower, we end up in the middle of the United States somewhere, maybe around Des Moines, Iowa, but we don't get to Denver. However, not only the ionosphere, but the Earth itself, the surface of the Earth itself, can reflect the HF signals, HF skywave signals, and bounce back up into the ionosphere and get a second refraction in the F2 layer and reach Denver. So this is what's called multi-hop propagation, and this is helpful in terms of reaching different locations that you might want to work. So all that said, remember back here we're talking, if we go back 2 slides, you can see that we're talking here about a skywave signal on 28 megahertz on 10 meters. And when we go to this multi-op illustration, we're talking about a skywave on 80 meters on 3.5 megahertz. So which band to use when? So basically speaking, the lower frequency bands, 160, 80, 60, and 40, they tend to be ground wave bands in the daytime, and that therefore local regional contacts during the daytime, and skywave propagation at night. Conversely, on the upper frequency bands, 30, 20, 17, 15, and 10, they're both ground wave and skywave in the daytime, and they're also skywave at night. So when they're open, you can have 24-hour propagation on a band like 20 meters, both locally and worldwide, depending on where you are in the sunspot cycle and where we are in the condition of the ionosphere. So again, let's take a look back at those layers again, and remember, in the daytime you can see the D, E, and F layers in the daytime, and those dissipate at night, and the F layers become merged. So why is that important? Well, it has to do with D-layer absorption. Okay, lower frequency waves get absorbed more in the D layer. And that's because, as you can see in this illustration, they sort of spend more time in the D layer where the charged particles can weaken the signal and eliminate the possibility of refraction back down to Earth. The larger waveform in a lower frequency wave spends more time in the D layer and gets absorbed, whereas at the bottom illustration, let's say a 10-meter wave travels through the D layer without much, if any, absorption, and therefore can reach the higher ionospheric layers, particularly the F layer, and that's what gives you the long distance propagation. So basically it works like this. As I said, if you look at a 3.5 megahertz wave at the top of this illustration, when ionization is low, the 3.5 megahertz wave can be refracted back down to Earth. This is what happens evenings and nighttime for DX propagation on, let's say, 80 meters or 160 meters. When ionization is low, the 28 megahertz wave, the 10-meter wave, is, I'll call it, too strong to be refracted sufficiently by the ionization to be pointed back down to Earth. And again, if you look at the bottom of the slide, the converse is true. With relatively high ionization, the 28 megahertz wave can be refracted down to Earth and gets a longer distance of refraction than the 3.5 or 80-meter wave. Now, if you want a really detailed, really good explanation of this, better than I could give, go to YouTube and do a search on the effects of the ionosphere on radio wave propagation, and you'll come across this 1948 US Army training film for the Signal Corps. And it does a really, really great job of explaining not only what I just outlined to you, but explains the mechanics of it, the science of it, and it's a really good explanation. It's a 30-minute long presentation. It's well worth your time sitting through it, and you can download it and save it for yourself off of YouTube and look at it at your convenience. So let's look at ionization, skywave, and sunspots. The ionization level that we talked about just a moment ago is determined by sunspot activity. More sunspots, basically, more ionization, more DX at higher frequencies. So sunspots rather, rise and fall in an 11-year cycle. You're probably familiar with this, discovered back in the 1800s by Heinrich Schwab, and he retrospectively started numbering the cycles with cycle number 1, 1755 to 1766. Here's a look at sunspot cycles from 1600 through today, and you can see where he started in the 1700s here. Let me see if I can get my pointer here. I can't find it. Hold on, I got to go back here. Let's go back. Here we go. Right, and you can see the rise and fall in the cycles every 11 or 11 and a half years or so till we get to here. The peak, highest peak of sunspot cycle was in 1959 in cycle 19 over here. Okay, and back up again. And now we go to this, and if you look at, here's a look at cycles in recent years, and as you can see, here's cycle 19 that we were talking about just a moment ago. Here's cycle 20. Here are the most recent cycles, 21, 22, 23, and we're now in cycle 24. And you can see that there's a weakening trend in solar cycles. And there is some speculation in the scientific community that this is a sign of what's called a cycle of cycles. And if you look back on this chart again, you can see here are rises and falls in the overall cycles of cycles. So currently, we seem to be in an area of decline, and that brings us to the question of what about cycle 25, which we just started. Cycle 25 just started about 2 years ago, December of 2019. You can see where we are coming up from the bottom of it. And this red line here, that's the projection, that's the consensus projection of what the cycle's going to look like. And as you can see, at least for the moment, we may be slightly ahead of that curve. And with any luck, maybe we continue ahead of that curve and end up someplace up here. But this is the consensus that's going to be pretty much equal to where we were in cycle 24, which isn't a bad thing, because a few years ago, there was a lot of speculation that cycle 25 was going to be a total bust. But right now, the speculation is it's going to be like this. Nobody really knows till after the fact. Solar cycle conditions vary from day to day and even hour to hour, so it's helpful to understand where you're at any particular point in time. You can find a chart like this many places on the internet. This one appears, for example, on the home page of QRZ.com. It comes from the URL that you see at the bottom of the screen, which has a lot of solar information. There's a lot of it even in this little box. The numbers I like to keep track of to keep it simple are the ones up here, SFI, which is the solar flux index, the A index and the K index. Solar sunspot number, not quite so important on a day-to-day basis, in my opinion. And basically, to oversimplify propagation, which could be another whole presentation on its own, SFIs, you want to look for a high solar flux index and low numbers in the A and K indices. High SFI, low A and K. Really simple to see what conditions may be like at any particular point in time. If you're looking for propagation to a specific point, we live in a wonderful age of the internet, and there are all kinds of propagation calculators. Probably the most common one is vocap.com, which you see illustrated here. Basically, it's a site. You go to the website, you plug in your QTH, you plug in the location on the Earth where you want to get your signal to or hear from, and it calculates that path that you can see here. In this case, it's a path from the Northeast United States to Australia. And on this side, in a color-coded wheel, it will tell you which bands to look for, what time of day that you have the best chance of achieving that path. Propagation Calculators, vocap.com, probably the best one to use on that. You can also look at what's going on at the moment that you turn on your radio. You can go to a site like this one on dxmaps.com, and this will show you what's going on in real time. All of these lines that you see here are actual contacts that are currently being made. Excuse me. Post-nasal drip. These are the QSOs that are in progress at the time that you're looking at this map. So you can see that if you're looking to have a QSO at this particular point in time shown on the map to Europe, there's lots of QSOs going on. You have a good chance. If you're looking for a contact with South Africa down here, not too much. So this is another way. Another thing you can do is just turn on your radio and look for yourself. If you have a recent model radio that has a band scope in it, you can turn on the radio, tune to a frequency on whatever band you're interested in, and see what the activity looks like. This is one I did on my radio back in October, tuned to sort of the middle of 20 meters to see what's going on. As you can see on the scope here, down at the low end, there's lots of activity, there's lots of CW activity going on here on 20 meters when I looked. There's some digital activity here. This bright line here, which you'll see on almost every band, that's FT8. Not much going on here in the middle of the band, but up here you can see what's going on the phone portion of the band. As you can see, there's lots of activity on 14 megahertz on 20 meters. When I looked here, and if I want to make a phone contact, I got a good chance of finding someone I can hear over here to answer a CQ, or pluck myself down in an empty spot like over here and call CQ. So how to make contacts? All right, well, basically two ways to do it: proactively, reactively. You can proactively call CQ, tune the band, look at the scope, get a feel for conditions as we just did, listen for a clear frequency, and ask if the frequency is in use. Send QRL on CW. The reason for this is, if you recall what we looked at in the illustrations of skip, there may be stations on a frequency that you don't hear. They're outside your skip zone. You don't hear them, but they might hear you, that kind of thing. That's how HF propagation works. On phone, how to call CQ? Well, you want to call CQ long enough to attract some attention, but not so long that someone gets tired of hearing you call CQ and keeps tuning. I usually, do, this is KS2G, Kilo Sierra 2 Golf, KS2G near New York City, calling CQ on 20 meters. The reason I like to put my location in, again, nowadays with call signs in the United States being what they were, I'm at KS2, but I'm in New York, and that's the way it used to be. But now you can find a KS2 might be in California, or you might find a KL7, which is an Alaskan call, but he's in, California rather than Alaska. So I like to put my location in my CQ to let people know more or less where I am. Calling CQ on RTTY, similar like that. Don't put in the location, not necessary. And you'll notice that in both instances, your call sign goes last. You call CQ, 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 and your call sign goes last. When you're making contacts, you can respond to CQs. You would call the station. I hear a station W2HF. Call, I say, hey, W2HF, this is KS2G, over, listening. So you can respond to CQs. And once again, give your call sign last. If you're DXing and you're in a DX pileup, just give your call sign phonetically on phone, and give your call sign quickly on CW. In DX station, let's say they're very popular. They've got a big pileup going someplace, so they tend to operate split. What is operating split? Okay. Split operation, means you're transmitting and receiving on different frequencies. This is like the offset of a repeater input-output setup. Those of you who are coming to HF from the world of VHF, UHF repeaters, you know that you transmit on, you set your radio on the receive frequency of the repeater, and there's an offset to make the radio transmit on the input frequency of the repeater. So that's the same as we do on HF. Now, almost all DXpeditions these days operate split. On phone, the DXpedition will tell you what they're doing. They'll say something like, this is their call sign up 5 or up 5 to 10. That means whatever frequency he's transmitting on, he's listening 5 or 5 to 10 kilohertz up from his transmit frequency. So let's say the DX station also might say he's on, let's say 14160. He might say, give his call sign and say 200 to 225. That means he's listening on 14200 to 14225, and that's where you should be transmitting. You need to learn how to use your rig's dual VFOs, which VFO A or B is transmitting, which one is receiving. It's very common for newcomers to split operation to be transmitting on the wrong VFO. They set up their VFO for the DX station. They think their VFO is on the receive frequency, but it's really on the transmit frequency, and that leads to all kinds of havoc. Popular activity on the HF bands is working contests. It's competitive amateur radio operating, trying to work as many stations as possible and as many places as possible as quickly as possible. There are lots of different contests, you check the contest rules for when it's operating and what the context exchange is. That's the information that you send to the other station as part of the contest operation. In contesting, again, you can be reactive or proactive. Proactive, you can run, that means you call CQ, or you can search and pounce and tune the band and respond to stations that are calling CQ. If you're interested in contesting operations, the next session coming up at 11 o'clock, our East Coast time, will be on contesting, and I'll be going into that in greater detail in that session. A word about logging in the United States. There's no legal requirement to keep a station log, and there has not been since 1983. But lots of, even most HF operators tend to keep a log. It's a useful record of their operating activity. And if you're looking to get QSLs for awards and stuff, you need certain information to send to the other station. You keep them in the log. Basically, for QSLs, you need the date and time in UTC, the frequency band and the mode that you've operated, and the call sign at the station you worked. Oftentimes you'll include a signal report, and in your log, it's oftentimes you put down notes, the name of the guy you worked or gal you worked, the QTH, the equipment he and you were using, etc. If you use logging in, on paper or electronically, you can keep that information. You can still keep a paper log. The ARRL still sells a paper log book. They also used to have a mini log. This was back in the days when there was a logging requirement. You operated mobile, you had to keep a log of your mobile operation, so they had a mini version of the log to keep in your vehicle. Computer logging is generally the way to go these days. There are general purpose loggings, lots of them out there. Here's a list of a few of them. DX Lab is very popular. There are the ones on the left are Windows applications. There are similar applications for Mac and Linux. There are specialized contest loggers. N1MM Plus is the most popular one. It's free. WriteLog is similar, but it's a commercial program. And there are loggers, as I said, for Mac and Linux as well. The reason you want to keep a log, as I said, is you may want to do QSLing. You might want to get confirmations. You can get confirmations on paper by directly sending cards. If you send cards stateside, it's a good courtesy to send a self-addressed stamped envelope or green stamps, dollar bills, to offset the cost on the other end. You can use QSL managers. These are people who are stateside, for example, who have the logs of DX stations. Therefore, you can send the QSL manager a QSL card for domestic postage and get back a QSL card. You can use QSL bureaus. ARRL has an outgoing QSL service for its members, and there are volunteer incoming DXL QSL bureaus in each of the 10 call districts in the United States. The one in the 2nd district is the North Jersey DX Association, and those incoming bureaus, you either send them money or stamped envelopes, and they have information on how about to do that. Electronic QSLing, that's the way to go these days. ARRL's Logbook of the World is the most popular electronic QSL confirmation system. There's another one called EQSL, and there's a third one for DXing primarily called ClubLog. They're not quite as popular, but they can be useful. And they're, the reason for getting all those QSL information, either electronically or in cards, are for the numerous awards that are available for HF operating. So let's talk a little bit about getting the most out of your HF transceiver. There's lots of controls on the front panel of an HF radio. If you're coming from the world of VHF, UHF, handy talkies, or mobiles, there's usually only just 1 or 2 dials and a little bit of a display. On a typical HF transceiver, there are transmitter controls. The RF power output, that's sort of self-explanatory. That's how many watts input output that you set up your radio for CW, digital, and SSP. There's a mic level control, usually, and a control oftentimes for speech processing or speech compression. Speech processing increases the average RF power and adds punch to your audio because the amount of power output on a single sideband signal is determined by the waveform of your audio, and I'll show you that in just a minute. When you're setting up your speech processing, you want to observe your ALC, your automatic level control. There'll be a transmit audio equalization control very often if your radio has that capability, controls highs and lows for maximum intelligibility. Transmit audio monitor, you want to listen to yourself as you transmit to see if you've got all these levels, mic level, speech processing, and so forth set up properly. And you want to just ask for audio reports from the stations that you work, and they can give you an idea of what you sound like on the other end. You can also use one of the online SDR radios to listen to yourself over the air. Let's talk about speech processing for a moment. If you look on the left side of this illustration, you can see that in a single sideband signal, it's very, very jagged, and the peaks are very high, but the average is pretty low. When you put in properly adjusted RF processing, it kind of squeezes down the peaks and therefore increases the average and gives you a much stronger signal. There are transmitter keying controls on your radio, Vox, voice operated transmitting. Basically, this is a setup where the transmitter is keyed by sensing your speech. When you start talking, the radio goes into transmit. When you stop talking, it goes back into receive, and that is controlled by a sensitivity control, a setting for hang time. In other words, if you're talking and you stop talking, how long does the radio stay in transmit before it reverts to receive, so it doesn't sort of drop back into receive basically every time you take a breath. And then there's anti-vox, which is to prevent the radio from going into transmit from ambient noise in your shack. CW break-in, automatic switching between transmit and receive. Similar to Vox for CW, there's full break-in, QSK. It switches from transmit receive immediately when the key contacts open in between elements of your transmitted CW signal. Semi break-in is when the key contacts open and switch to receive is delayed by a set duration, similar to the delay hang time in Vox, and it's usually controlled by the Vox setting on the radio for semi break-in. More than likely, radios these days have an automatic antenna tuner. The automatic antenna tuner matches the out of resonance antenna to an impedance of 50 ohms to keep your radio happy. And the reason for that, it maintains full transmit power output. Modern solid state radios, transmitters, they fold back or lower the output power to mismatched antenna loads to prevent damage to the final output power transistors, which are sensitive to high SWR. So you want to learn how to use your automatic antenna tuner to prevent that from happening. Now, onto the receive side, there's audio frequency gain. Basically, that's your volume control. RF gain is the radio frequency gain. Manually adjust your receiver sensitivity. It's usually left at maximum in conjunction with automatic gain control. AGC adjusts the receiver sensitivity in response to changes in signal strength, and basically it's sort of like compression for received signals. So the very loud signals get squeezed down to a manageable level, and the weaker signals get boosted up to a manageable level. There are usually two settings, fast and slow. Sometimes there's a medium. Fast response for CW, slow response for SSB, and on some radios you can turn off automatic gain control entirely and ride your RF gain to determine how you want the signal to sound. This can be very useful in terms of weak signal work when there are low noise levels. Receiver sensitivity controls. Oftentimes there's an RF attenuator. This reduces your receiver sensitivity by a set amount. RF preamp is the reverse of that. It increases receiver sensitivity by a set amount. Radios that have FM in it, HF radios that have FM will have a squelch control. It works the same as a squelch control on a UHF, VHF radio. It mutes the receiver when no signal is present, and you leave it wide open for all modes except FM. Receiver tuning controls that can be useful here. The RIT, receiver incremental tuning. Yaesu radios call this the clarifier. This enables you to change the receive frequency of your radio without transmitting without changing your transmit frequency. And this can be useful if you call CQ and a station answers you but is slightly off frequency. Rather than change your transmit frequency to match him, you change your receive frequency using RIT to keep your transmit frequency the same. XIT, or transmit incremental tuning, is the reverse of that. It can change the transmit frequency without changing the receive frequency. Sometimes you can use this if the range of XIT is broad enough. You can use that for split operations in the absence of a second VFO. Interference controls, unlike 2-meter 440 FM, there's lots of noise and stuff on the HF bands. Noise filters or noise reduction reduce steady background noise like a background hiss and so forth. Noise blankers reduce pulsating background noise. This is the kind of noise that you get, staticky noise that you get if you operate mobile and you have a car with a noisy alternator, or there are wall warts making noise in your house or your neighbor's house, causing this staticky chattering noise. That's for noise blankers. Notch filters, they null out specific interfering frequencies. This is useful. Let's see, if you look at this diagram, you can see the U shape is your band pass. The shaded portion is your received signal on single sideband, and the vertical line is a heterodyne. And it's very annoying to have that whistling heterodyne while you're listening to the station. And using a notch filter, you can tune that out and leave the desired signal in place. Likewise, bandwidth controls are useful in the same way. You can see on the right side of this illustration, the dotted line is your band pass, and there's an interfering signal in the vertical line, and you can use your IF shift to shift the entire band pass, in this case to the left, to receive just the desired signal and not the interfering signal. And wide and narrow roofing filters do the same thing on a fixed basis. You can see the illustration here. The desired signal is in the middle. The bandpass is very wide. If you put in a narrow filter on the right-hand side, you can hear the signal you desire, but not hear the signals that are now outside the passband. And then there are variable bandwidth filters, which enable you to do a combination of the ones I just described. They enable you to vary the bandwidth of your passband and so forth. So those are your bandwidth controls. So I'm about out of time. That kind of wraps up where we're on today. I don't know if we have any question. I would just tell you again, remind you that this slide deck and a link to a recording of this presentation will be posted on the HRU website. If you go to the HRU website, I'd urge you to consider, please make a donation to Ham Radio University. Ham University, even when it was in person, was free. We used to ask for a voluntary $5 donation, and we continue that for our online version here. It does cost us a certain amount of money to have use of the GoToWebinar platform and the other expenses that go with our efforts here at Ham Radio University. So that is about it. I think we got about 2 minutes left. George, real quick, are there any questions that got posted that I can answer in the 2 minutes we have left?
Let's see. On split, talk about why up can be a range.
Up can be arranged because the DX station wants the signals to spread out. You know, wants this pile up to spread out, so all of the stations aren't on a single frequency, but they're spread out over, let's say, 5 kilohertz. So he can sort of pick out the signals better rather than have everybody, you know, exactly 5 kilohertz up. If he's 5 to 10 up, I might be 5 up, you might be 7 up, another station might be 9 up, and he can, you know, tune that range to find the signals that he can hear. Anything else, George?
There's a bunch of other questions, but you don't have much time. How do you know what frequency exactly?
I'm not quite sure what that question means. You know what frequency exactly you're on by the readout on your dial or your digital display. Likewise, the station that you're tuning into, you tune into the frequency until, let's say, on a CW signal that you have the right side tone, or on a sideband signal that it sounds normal to you in terms of speech characteristics. I think that's probably about it, right, George?
Yeah, that's about it. You can wrap.
Okay. Again, thank you all for listening to all of this. In 10 minutes time, I'll be doing another session specifically on contesting. If you have any questions and you'd like me to answer them in person, send me an email, ks2g@arrl.net. The slide deck will be posted on the website, and the recording will be on YouTube, and there'll be a link to it on the HRU website. Thank you all for listening to me. I hope I've been helpful to you. Have a good rest of the day, and 73.